The snow fell thick over the streets of St. Petersburg, muffling the sounds of the city. Midnight had passed, and the majority of the city's residents had retreated behind closed doors, seeking warmth from the bitter February cold. Yet, in the heart of the imperial capital, lights shone in one grand palace, a space alive with anticipation and secrecy. Inside, servants moved quietly, setting out cakes, arranging wine, and preparing for a guest who would arrive unaware that every detail of his evening had been orchestrated to end his life. That guest was Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin, a man whose name had become synonymous with power, scandal, and fear. To understand why Rasputin inspired such devotion and such hatred, we must begin far from the gilded halls of Russian royalty, in a small Siberian village called Pokrovskoye. Born into a poor farming family in 1869, Rasputin lived a simple, unremarkable childhood. He worked the fields alongside his father, learned the rhythms of rural life, and eventually married, fathering several children. Literacy eluded him, and the world of politics and high society seemed impossibly distant. Yet, beneath this unassuming exterior stirred a man who would one day walk among emperors. At the age of 28, Rasputin's life shifted irreversibly. Something within him, an obsession with the divine, a calling he could not deny, compelled him to abandon home and family. He embarked on a pilgrimage across the Russian countryside, wandering from town to town, a figure of mystery and charisma. Wherever he went, people were captivated. Villagers and priests alike reported miracles, sudden recoveries from illness, inexplicable healings, and moments of spiritual clarity that seemed to flow through his presence. Slowly, he attracted followers. A small circle began to gather around him, drawn by his magnetic personality and the promise of divine insight. By 1905, Rasputin's reputation had reached heights few could have imagined for a man of peasant origin. Whispers of his abilities reached the imperial family, and soon he was summoned to the Winter Palace itself. The cause was urgent. The Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the Russian throne, suffered from hemophilia, a condition that left him vulnerable to even minor injuries. Medical treatments provided little relief, and the boy's life hung in a delicate balance. Rasputin's methods were unorthodox. He prayed with the young prince, offering what he described as spiritual guidance rather than medicine. And, as contemporaneous accounts report, the boy's condition improved. Whether it was faith, coincidence, or a combination, Rasputin's influence over Alexei became undeniable. This single act earned him the trust, and eventually the dependence, of Tsarina Alexandra, one of the most powerful women in Russia. Rasputin was invited into her confidence, consulted on matters ranging from courtly affairs to national policy, and gradually became a fixture in the Yusupov Palace. In just a few years, he had climbed from obscure peasant to a figure whose advice shaped the destiny of an empire. Yet Rasputin's rise to power carried a shadow. The man who could heal also drank heavily and lived a life of excess. He cultivated relationships with women throughout St. Petersburg, often inviting them to his apartments for nights of revelry. In 1915, the police, acting on rumors of his indiscretions, began clandestinely following his movements. They recorded a series of escapades, evenings spent with multiple women, late-night returns home inebriated, and incidents of confinement that bordered on coercion. His behavior scandalized many, yet it did little to diminish the devotion of the Empress. With Alexandra's backing, Rasputin began to exert influence beyond spiritual matters. He suggested appointments for ministers, offered advice on military strategy, and became an intermediary between the Tsarina and political figures. By 1915, the public's opinion of him had soured. To ordinary Russians, the Empress appeared to be under the spell of a corrupt mystic, and rumors of Rasputin's manipulations circulated widely, even if censorship made open discussion risky. It was in this climate of fear and resentment that a new voice arose in the halls of power. Vladimir Purishkevich, thus a member of the Duma, delivered a fiery speech in November 1916, denouncing Rasputin as a malignant force at the heart of Russia. For many, this was the first time their private indignation had been expressed publicly, and in the audience that day sat a young aristocrat, Felix Yusupov, a man whose wealth and family connections positioned him at the apex of society, but whose moral compass saw Rasputin as the embodiment of evil threatening to consume the empire. Yusupov's reaction was immediate. Rasputin had to be stopped. To him, political maneuvering would not suffice. The mystical healer, the drunken prophet, the corrupter of the court, he must be removed permanently. Thus began the meticulous planning that would culminate in one of the most infamous assassinations in Russian history. The contrast was stark. From the frozen Siberian fields to the gilded corridors of the Winter Palace, Rasputin's life had been a journey of extremes. Revered and reviled, beloved and despised, he had become the pivot upon which the fate of an empire seemed to turn. And now, as the first hints of midnight frost coated the streets outside Yusupov's palace, a trap was being set that would test the very limits of human cunning, and perhaps even the limits of life itself. The streets of St. Petersburg lay deserted under the cold February sky, the icy wind whispering across cobblestones like a premonition. Inside the grand Yusupov Palace, the air was warm, scented with roses, wax, and the faint sweetness of cream. The scene seemed innocent, even festive. A lavish table laid with pink cakes, polished silverware, and crystal glasses filled with deep red wine. But this celebration was unlike any other. Every detail had been planned with one single purpose: to end the life of Grigori Rasputin. Felix Yusupov and his co-conspirators, Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich, Dr. Stanislaus Lazovert, Lieutenant Sergei Sukhotin, and politician Vladimir Purishkevich, knew the man they were about to confront was no ordinary adversary. Rasputin's influence over the imperial family, his seeming invincibility, and his scandalous reputation made him both feared and loathed. To kill him, they would need cunning, courage, and absolute secrecy. The plan had been drawn with precision. Rasputin would be lured to the palace under the pretense of meeting Yusupov's young wife, Irina, at a private party. Yusupov had fabricated a series of chest pains, insisting that only Rasputin's healing powers could save him. Over several weeks, he cultivated a friendship, gaining the mystic's trust. Rasputin, ever the charmer, eagerly anticipated the evening, drawn by the promise of Irina's company. At precisely 12:15 a.m., Yusupov departed for Rasputin's apartment, Dr. Lazovert posing as his chauffeur. The streets were silent, the lamps casting long shadows over the frozen canals. By the time they reached the palace gates, a minor complication arose. The gates were closed. Calm yet tense, they drove slowly around, hoping to avoid drawing attention, until the entrance finally yielded. Inside, the rest of the gang waited in the basement dining room, the concrete walls thick and unyielding, a perfect trap. Dr. Lazovert began his grim work, grating cyanide into the cream layers of the cakes, carefully pouring the powder into glasses of wine. Each item on the table was now a potential weapon, silent and invisible, ready to strike. Meanwhile, Rasputin prepared for the evening in his modest apartment. Unaware of the danger, he informed his daughter and secretary that he would be out, betraying none of the deadly intrigue awaiting him. For him, this was merely another night of social engagement and indulgence. He dressed carefully, his long coat brushing against the floor, and stepped into the snow-laden streets, a man walking into the jaws of fate. At the palace, time stretched. The conspirators moved quietly, arranging cakes, playing soft music on a gramophone to simulate a lively gathering, and leaving traces of activity on the table to suggest the other guests had moved upstairs. Everything was ready. Rasputin arrived shortly after midnight, his tall figure casting a shadow across the polished floors. Yusupov greeted him warmly, ushering him down to the basement with a practiced ease. Dr. Lazovert returned upstairs, joining the others as Yusupov and Rasputin settled in at the table. The first moments were deceptively calm. Conversation flowed, polite and measured, as Rasputin eyed the cakes and wine, unaware of the poison lying in wait. Minutes became half an hour, then an hour. Rasputin, ever discerning, seemed unaffected. The cyanide, potent and lethal, had no apparent effect. Yusupov's heart pounded. He excused himself, running upstairs to inform the men waiting in silence. "He is not eating. He is not drinking," he reported. The tension in the room tightened. Rasputin laughed, spoke, moved with the same confident ease that had unnerved emperors and nobles alike. Another 30 minutes passed, and the poisoned treats remained untouched. Rasputin's charm and arrogance filled the room. His eyes gleamed with an uncanny vitality. Yusupov returned upstairs, desperate, and found no solution. He descended once more, this time with a pistol concealed beneath his coat. When the gun fired, the sound cracked through the cold air, echoing against the basement walls. Rasputin collapsed, twitching and struggling, but not immediately lifeless. The conspirators rushed down to witness a sight both horrifying and surreal. Rasputin gasped, his body convulsing, yet he still clung to life, a living embodiment of the fear and fascination he had inspired for years. Panic surged among the men, but there was no time to hesitate. Following their plan, 3 of the conspirators drove to Purishkevich's train to destroy evidence, while Lieutenant Sukhotin donned Rasputin's coat, creating a diversion for any spies observing from a distance. Back at the palace, chaos unfolded. Rasputin, defying death, staggered into the courtyard. Purishkevich fired at him repeatedly, bullets missing in the icy darkness. The mystic's final moments were a macabre dance between life and death. Eventually, the shots found their mark, piercing his back, and he fell for the last time. It was past 3 in the morning. The palace was silent except for the shuffling of men moving quickly to follow the plan. They wrapped Rasputin's body in a curtain, drove through the frozen streets to Pokrovskoye Bridge, and weighed the corpse before casting it into the icy Neva River. The work was done, though in haste and confusion. A shoe was left behind, blood marked the courtyard, and the city itself bore witness to the violent conclusion. 2 days later, the river revealed its secret. Rasputin's body was found frozen beneath the ice, his death unmistakably violent. Despite the brutal clarity, the Tsar chose not to arrest Yusupov or the conspirators. Russia teetered on the edge of revolution, and further instability could not be risked. The 5 men scattered. Some fled the country, others remained, haunted by their deed. Yusupov would live out his exile in France, carrying the memory of that night and the weight of history until his death. Rasputin's legend, however, did not die with him. the story of a man who had risen from obscurity to touch the very throne, and who had defied death itself, would endure for generations. His life and his end remained a haunting reminder of power, obsession, and the deadly allure of influence at the heart of an empire. The icy waters of the Neva River had claimed Grigori Rasputin's body, yet his influence refused to vanish. In the streets of St. Petersburg, whispers spread like wildfire. Who had dared to kill the man the Empress trusted most? How could such a figure, so despised and yet so seemingly invincible, finally meet his end? The city was consumed with rumors, some speaking of miraculous survival, others of divine retribution. The mystique surrounding Rasputin only deepened in death. For the conspirators, the night of February 16th, or by some accounts, the early hours of the 17th, was only the beginning. Yusupov, Purishkevich, Lazovert, Pavlovich, and Sukhotin had acted with audacity, yet their actions carried the weight of political peril. They had murdered a man at the very heart of the empire, a figure intertwined with the royal family. Even now, they could not know how the Tsar would respond, or whether the fragile threads of Russia's monarchy would survive this violent disruption. Tsar Nicholas II faced a dilemma. Rasputin's death removed an individual widely viewed as corrupt, manipulative, and dangerous. Yet arresting the conspirators risked alienating the aristocracy and provoking unrest in a capital already tense with war fatigue, economic strain, and growing revolutionary fervor. The Tsar chose caution, a decision that reflected the paralysis that had long plagued his reign. For the conspirators, this hesitation became an unspoken shield, allowing them to retreat from St. Petersburg, their role in Rasputin's death known only to a select few. The public, however, did not need confirmation from the monarchy. Newspapers, which had once feared censorship, now reported freely on Rasputin's death, painting him alternately as a saint, a sinner, a charlatan, and a villain. Tales of his debauchery, political meddling, and spiritual manipulations became front-page stories, feeding the populace's fascination and resentment. Rasputin's murder became a symbol. Some saw it as justice, others as a dangerous act of vigilantism. Across Russia, people debated morality, power, and the unseen forces steering their nation. Felix Yusupov and his co-conspirators dispersed, each carrying the invisible burden of complicity. Yusupov himself fled to France with his wife Irina, leaving behind the crumbling empire that had so nearly been consumed by Rasputin's shadow. Purishkevich remained in Russia, continuing his political career for a brief time before succumbing to illness in 1920. Lazovert, Pavlovich, and Sukhotin left for Europe, quietly retreating into anonymity. History would remember them not as ordinary men, but as architects of one of the most infamous assassinations in Russian history. A deed that, though hidden from public view at the moment, would echo through the decades. Yet Rasputin's death did not solve the deeper problems facing the Romanovs. The empire teetered on the edge of revolution, its foundations eroded by war, economic hardship, and discontent. The Tsarina, relieved to be rid of her mystical advisor, remained in power but increasingly isolated. Nicholas II, indecisive and constrained by tradition, failed to act decisively against mounting threats. Within months, the pressures that had already gripped Russia intensified, setting the stage for the catastrophic upheavals of 1917. In the months following Rasputin's assassination, Russia's political landscape shifted unpredictably. The Duma gained influence, revolutionaries plotted, and soldiers, weary from the front lines of World War I, began questioning loyalty to a monarchy that seemed detached from their suffering. Rasputin's death had removed a single figure, but it had also exposed the fragility of the imperial system. The Romanovs had lost not only an advisor, but a scapegoat, a convenient figure onto whom the public could project its anger. Without Rasputin, scrutiny fell squarely upon the Tsar and Tsarina. Even in exile, Yusupov reflected on the consequences of that night. In memoirs written decades later, he portrayed himself as a man compelled by duty and patriotism, a defender of Russia against an evil influence. Yet history offers a more complex truth. The murder, though decisive, was chaotic, almost farcical. Poison failed, bullets missed, and the mystic's final moments were marked by a strange, uncanny resilience. It was a night in which human planning clashed with the unpredictable forces of life, mortality, and perhaps destiny itself. Meanwhile, Rasputin's legend grew. Artists, writers, and journalists across Europe and Russia recounted his life as a cautionary tale. A peasant who rose to power through charisma, cunning, and spiritual allure, whose influence threatened kings and princes, and whose death, violent and theatrical, symbolized both the vulnerability and corruption of an empire. He became a figure larger than life, simultaneously reviled and mythologized, a testament to the volatile intersection of power, superstition, and politics. For Russia, the consequences were immediate and severe. Rasputin's assassination did not save the monarchy. It exposed its fragility. By 1917, less than a year after the mystic's death, the February Revolution would erupt, toppling Nicholas II, ending centuries of Romanov rule, and plunging the nation into civil war and chaos. Rasputin, in life and in death, had been a catalyst, a mirror reflecting the empire's corruption, instability, and desperation. His murder was an act of audacity, yet history would prove that no single man, no matter how hated, could alter the trajectory of a crumbling state. And so, the frozen Neva held more than a body beneath its ice. It held the end of an era, a warning of the fragility of power, and a reminder that those who manipulate influence and those who seek to end it often dance perilously close to forces they cannot control. Rasputin's story, violent and extraordinary, was not merely the tale of a man. It was the tale of a nation teetering on the brink, a chronicle of fear, obsession, and the inexorable pull of destiny. Grigori Rasputin's life ended in the icy Neva River, yet the story of the man who defied death continued to grow, taking on a life far beyond the reality of his mortal existence. Even in the months following his assassination, rumors spread like wildfire. Newspapers, letters, and whispered conversations painted a portrait of a man both terrifying and miraculous, a mystical figure who had wielded unimaginable power over emperors and empresses alike. The truth of that February night was already almost mythic. Accounts varied, often wildly, with witnesses embellishing or omitting details. Some claimed Rasputin survived poison, bullets, and beatings, only to stagger into the snow with a supernatural resilience. Others insisted that the mystic's gaze could bend the will of men, that his death had required multiple shots at close range. These stories blurred the line between fact and legend, creating an enduring aura of fear and fascination around the man who had risen from Siberian obscurity to touch the throne of Russia. In the royal court, Rasputin's influence lingered. Empress Alexandra, who had relied on him for both guidance and the health of her son, mourned his death privately, though the world only glimpsed the veil of isolation it cast over her. To many in the aristocracy, Rasputin's removal was a relief, a symbolic victory over corruption and immorality. Yet the act itself revealed the precariousness of the monarchy, and for some, the assassination foreshadowed the sweeping changes to come. The myths of Rasputin were amplified by those who had killed him. Felix Yusupov, writing memoirs decades later, recounted a tale of courage and patriotism, a man forced by conscience to eliminate a malign influence threatening the empire. But even in Yusupov's account, the story was imbued with a strange, almost supernatural quality. Rasputin, he suggested, had possessed an almost magical endurance. Poisoned cakes failed, bullets missed, and the mystic walked toward death as if guided by some otherworldly force. Such narratives only fueled the mystique, ensuring that Rasputin would be remembered less as a historical figure and more as a symbol, an enigma embodying the intersection of faith, power, and moral panic. Writers, journalists, and filmmakers would later cement Rasputin's place in popular imagination. Tales of his mystical powers, his sexual exploits, and his ability to manipulate the imperial family spread far beyond Russia. Some portrayed him as the ultimate charlatan, a man who rose by preying on superstition and fear. Others depicted him as a victim of circumstance, a mystic persecuted for threatening entrenched power. Both versions contained kernels of truth, but each simplified a complex reality into legend. What made Rasputin's story endure was not merely the violence of his death, but the way it reflected the fragility of the world around him. He was mirror of the empire itself, unstable, indulgent, and teetering on the edge of collapse. His rise revealed the vulnerability of the Romanovs. His influence exposed the corruption and discontent simmering beneath the surface, and his murder highlighted the desperation of those who felt powerless in the face of a crumbling order. The psychological impact of Rasputin's life and death cannot be overstated. For the people of Russia, he represented both fascination and fear. Some prayed for his guidance even after he was gone. Others rejoiced at his demise, seeing it as justice for the empire's sins. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked influence, the moral compromises of those in power, and the perils of personal obsession masquerading as divine providence. In exile, Yusupov lived with the duality of victory and guilt. He had succeeded in killing the man he considered a threat, yet he could not escape the chaotic, almost absurd nature of the assassination. The night that had been planned with meticulous care had spiraled into confusion. Poison had failed, bullets had missed, and the final moments of Rasputin's life had been strangely prolonged. The event became a legend in itself, a testament to the unpredictability of human action, and perhaps to forces beyond human comprehension. For historians, Rasputin's legacy is instructive. He is not remembered solely for the sensational tales of his life or the violent spectacle of his death. He is a symbol of the vulnerability of institutions to individual influence, the dangers of moral and political corruption, and the ways in which fear and superstition can shape history. The assassination, as dramatic as it was, did little to halt the collapse of the Romanovs. The empire continued its downward spiral, ultimately culminating in revolution and civil war. Rasputin's name, however, would never be forgotten. From Russian folklore to Western literature, from films to documentaries, he became the archetype of the dangerous mystic, the charismatic manipulator, the man who could charm kings and unsettle nations. His life and death continue to inspire fascination, horror, and moral reflection. They remind us that history is shaped not only by policies and armies, but by individuals whose presence, personality, and choices reverberate far beyond their own time. Even today, the icy Neva, where Rasputin's body once lay beneath the frozen surface, serves as a silent monument to the extraordinary life and death of a man who defied social conventions, spiritual norms, and mortal expectations. He remains, in death as in life, a figure of fear and fascination, a man whose story warns of the consequences when power, superstition, and human desire collide. And so, Rasputin endures, not merely as a man, but as a legend, a symbol, and a reminder that history is often stranger, darker, and more morally complex than any fiction could convey. His life was chaos. His death was violent, and the myth that grew from both continues to captivate the imagination of the world. Even as Grigori Rasputin's body sank beneath the frozen Neva, the tremors of his life and death rippled far beyond the icy waters. Russia itself seemed to shudder under the weight of the consequences. The empire, already strained by war, famine, and social unrest, was now confronting the brutal reality that no single act, no matter how dramatic, could resolve its systemic collapse. Rasputin's assassination had removed one figure, but it did not save the monarchy. It did not heal the fractures within society, and it did not halt the inexorable march toward revolution. Tsar Nicholas II, once confident that his family and authority were untouchable, now faced the stark reality of vulnerability. The Romanovs' image of invincibility had been irrevocably tarnished. The people, who had once whispered about Rasputin's corrupting influence, now saw the monarchy itself as a fragile, wavering institution, subject to manipulation, fear, and violent reprisal. The lines between private scandal and public crisis blurred, and every action, every decision was scrutinized under the unforgiving eye of a nation on the edge. The political fallout was immediate. Yusupov, Purishkevich, and the other conspirators had acted out of loyalty to the empire, or so they claimed. But their deed underscored the breakdown of authority. If nobles and aristocrats could kill a man so closely entwined with the royal family, what did it mean for the Tsar's command over the state? Soldiers on the front lines, peasants in the countryside, and city workers weary from hunger and war began to see the monarchy not as a guiding hand, but as a fragile, compromised entity. By the spring of 1917, less than a year after Rasputin's death, the February Revolution erupted. Factories struck, streets filled with protesters, and soldiers mutinied. The abdication of Nicholas II marked the end of 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Rasputin, who had lived and died as a mystical intermediary between the Tsarina and her empire, became in death a symbol of the monarchy's failures. His assassination had been a desperate act of control over a system that was already slipping from human hands. Yusupov, in exile, reflected on the irony. In removing Rasputin, he had believed he was saving Russia, yet the empire collapsed nonetheless. The mystic's death did not alter history's course. It merely punctuated it with a night of audacious violence, leaving a legend that would overshadow both the empire's fall and the conspirators' own lives. He and Irina lived quietly in France, far from St. Petersburg, yet the memory of that night, the chaos, the near-miraculous survival, the final shots fired in the courtyard, haunted them. Purishkevich remained in Russia until his death, a reminder that ambition, ideology, and personal conviction could collide with fate in ways that left lasting marks on history. Meanwhile, Rasputin's myth continued to grow. Stories of his invincibility, of poison, bullets, and near-death experiences were repeated across Europe. He became the archetype of the dangerous, charismatic outsider who could bend kings and emperors to his will. Novels, plays, and films depicted him as a figure both seductive and horrifying, a man whose spiritual power was entwined with moral corruption, and whose life and death blurred the boundaries between fact and legend. But beyond legend, Rasputin's story offers enduring lessons about power, influence, and human fallibility. His rise revealed how a single individual could exploit devotion, superstition, and fear to achieve extraordinary influence. His behavior demonstrated the risks of moral compromise and indulgence, even when cloaked in the guise of spiritual authority. And his death revealed the limits of human control, the way meticulous planning can collide with unpredictability, turning a carefully orchestrated murder into a chaotic, almost farcical ordeal. Rasputin's life and death also illuminate the fragility of institutions. The Russian monarchy, tied to centuries of tradition and divine right, had depended on appearances, secrecy, and loyalty. When those structures failed, when public perception, personal obsession, and political intrigue intersected, the consequences were catastrophic. Rasputin, in life, had symbolized both the corruption and the vulnerability of the empire. In death, he became a harbinger of its collapse. Across Russia in the decades that followed, Rasputin's story persisted not just as a historical anecdote, but as a moral and psychological mirror. He embodied the dangers of unchecked influence and the seductive power of charisma. He reminded those in power that authority can be manipulated, that loyalty can be exploited, and that even the most legendary of individuals is mortal, yet capable of shaping the destinies of millions. For historians, for storytellers, and for the public, Rasputin remains a figure who defies simple categorization. He was a peasant, a mystic, a manipulator, a healer, a sinner, and a saint in the eyes of some. His life and death illustrate the complexity of human behavior, the perilous interplay of morality and ambition, and the extraordinary consequences that can arise from the choices of a single individual. And so, as the Neva River continued to flow beneath the frozen Pokrovskoye Bridge, as the Winter Palace stood silent and gilded, and as Russia itself convulsed under revolution, the shadow of Grigori Rasputin lingered. His story was no longer just the tale of a man. It was the story of an empire in turmoil, of history shaped by audacity and fear, of mortality confronted by myth. He had walked from Siberian obscurity to the center of power, had defied poison, bullets, and time, and had become immortal in legend, if not in life. Rasputin's death was only the beginning of the empire's reckoning. In the years that followed, Russia would experience war, revolution, and civil strife on a scale unimaginable to the peasant-turned-mystic who had once prayed for a boy with bleeding wounds. And yet, in every retelling of his life and death, Rasputin endures, a haunting testament to the extraordinary ways a single individual can shape history, and the enduring consequences when fear, obsession, and ambition collide in the shadows of power.